Singapore.
With more on this historic summit, we're joined by the CBC's Lyndsay Duncombe. This hour, she's taking your questions about what happened in Singapore and what's next. You can participate on the CBC social media platforms. That's Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. So to help kick it off, Lyndsay joins us from Washington. Lyndsay, what's the early reaction in Washington to this summit?
Well, I think much of the assessments in the media are in line with what Sasha just said, that it appears as though the president has given away concessions with respect to the military exercises, with respect to the fact that this meeting happened in such a spectacle where the two men appeared to be on equal footing, without getting much in return that was guaranteed on paper. Although Trump certainly did say that he trusts Kim to live up to the goal of denuclearization, the words verified certainly weren't there. There was no plan for inspections, no timelines. The sense is that those things may be worked out by the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and others, but this is being received critically by those papers that are normally critical of the president. A headline from, I believe, the New York Times said that Donald Trump was outfoxed by Kim Jong-un. He's called naive. I think that was in the Washington Post. It's also been interesting to see the reaction from Republicans because, of course, many Republicans have been reluctant to criticize the president on many issues. But Marco Rubio did say that he was uncomfortable on Twitter with the idea that these military exercises would be suspended without a guaranteed position of denuclearization. And he went on to criticize the president's language about his interactions with the Korean dictator. There certainly was flattery here. We heard Donald Trump say that Kim was talented. He described him as a good negotiator. In contrast to that, Republican Senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, said, I know POTUS is trying to butter him up to get a good deal, but he's not talented. Rubio goes on to describe the dictator as a total weirdo. Rashmi.
And let's talk about the actual document that was signed, right? It's been noted that it just reaffirms already existing positions. Was there anything new that came from the meeting?
Well, I think the idea that there would be the repatriation of remains was something that is going to be seen as a point in the United States bonus or going ahead of the game. However, no, the language on the most important part of this, denuclearization, doesn't go as far as previous agreements had gone. And it doesn't go as far as what Mike Pompeo said yesterday would be the starting point. The starting point for any kind of concessions, according to the administration up until the point that Kim and Trump were in the room, was that there wouldn't be action for action, that the United States wanted guarantees of denuclearization before any concessions were given. And the fact that the word verify isn't in the document and that there's no timeline signed on, no inspections process, is one thing. But when you combine that with the fact that that is the case and the language is so flimsy at the same time as you're getting what is appeared to be a major concession by the president on the military exercises, I think that's where a lot of the criticism is coming in. But I just read a draft of soon-to-be published analysis from Keith Bogue, and Keith is keen to point out, as many other people are today, that the idea of talking to North Korea, whatever the parameters of the conversation, just like waking up in the morning, is better than the alternative. So all of the judgment for what this deal does not achieve should also be looked at in the framework of where we were last summer, which is when there were people talking about fire and fury and little rocket men and comparing the size of nuclear weapons. What this does is, at least in the short term, eliminates the possibility, or continues to eliminate the possibility, of military action. So certainly there is a short-term peace achievement here, even if there's a lot of warranted criticism for how it came about and how to compare this deal with where we've been in the past.
Okay, and now looking ahead, Lyndsay, a question from YouTube. When do you foresee the next meeting, and where would be a suitable venue?
Well, it's interesting that both of the leaders said that they would be willing to visit each other's countries. This was a carefully orchestrated spectacle, so you can just imagine if we had Kim Jong-un wheel up behind me at the White House or Donald Trump go to Pyongyang. I think it is very premature to imagine those meetings actually taking place. And the most important meetings are actually happening at this moment, and that is Mike Pompeo in Seoul talking to the South Koreans who were taken aback by the idea of not continuing military exercises. It is the meetings that will happen with Japan, with China. Watch what happens next as Kim Jong-un goes through and tries to, bring this idea on the peninsula for a larger agreement. A lot of work has to be done behind the scenes before these two leaders could meet again and declare a success, because I think there is a sense that the success that they declared today, although historic and although certainly better than a military situation, is premature.
All right, Lyndsay, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rashmi.
Lyndsay Duncombe, and she will continue to answer your questions about the summit online. There she goes on her phone. Go to CBC News on Facebook or Twitter, and you can also see it on our YouTube channel.
Hello, Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. My name is Lyndsay Duncombe. Not sure if you were watching us on the earlier feed with CBC News Network, but we are still here and we're happy to answer your questions on YouTube and on Facebook. This is about the agreement, the one-page agreement with 4 points that was reached between the President of the United States and the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. Certainly an historic moment, and we're going to try to break it down for you as much as we can. We have a question coming to us from Facebook, and it's from Lori Jane Jerome, and asks, is the U.S. president going to honor any agreement made? In one sense, I think there's a little bit of skepticism about whether or not he'll be able to honor that particular commitment on military exercises being canceled, because what we saw in the hours after he made that announcement was that the Pentagon was caught off guard by the fact that their routine joint exercises that both the United States and South Korea have said are important for security were going to be called off as part of this. And that is one of the things that is being called a major concession today. So I expect that that might be one way in which we could see Donald Trump back away from what it is that he promised there. Beyond that, he didn't promise, much more. So I think watch that for sure and see how it plays out with the dealings with South Korea. And actually, there's a question about South Korea from Ron Thibodeau, who's also watching us on Facebook. He asked, why was South Korea not present? And I think this was very much a one-on-one situation between the leaders of these two countries. But we can't deny that this probably would not have happened, or it wouldn't have happened, if it weren't for the influence of President Moon and South Korea. It was Moon that arranged the whole thing happening in the first place. And Moon had that meeting a few weeks back where he met with Kim, going over the border. That was another diplomatic spectacle. A lot of the analysis coming out of the region is there are two reasons why North Korea was in a position to have these discussions. One of them, of course, is the fact that it had built up its nuclear arsenal to the point where North Korea felt like it was in a position of power. But the other one is the fact that they do believe they have a partner in this, in Moon in South Korea. He is a progressive politician on the scale in South Korea. He wants to see a peace in his own country, I think very much like Donald Trump. He sees that as an achievement. So South Korea was not at this meeting, but certainly South Korea is very much a part of what happens next. And to give you a sense of how important that is, where's Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, right now? He is on his way, if he's not already in South Korea, having discussions with their leaders, probably trying to explain exactly what Donald Trump meant when he said that those military actions would be canceled. Gary Haas asks, is there anything that helps the people from North Korea? I think that the idea of peace generally and any kind of movement towards peace is certainly helpful in the long run. It is better than the imminent threat of retaliation from a nuclear strike. But human rights and the conditions in which people in North Korea live were not addressed largely in this summit. Donald Trump was asked about that, and he sort of brushed over the language, saying that it's a rough situation there and that there were other rough spots in the world. That is an underestimation of the language. You've got thousands of people in concentration camp style prisons. It is a reclusive society. You cannot speak out against the regime. People, well, there certainly is a fervor of support that is often manufactured, I suspect, and people live in fear. That was not the goal of this summit, to deal with those overarching issues. Certainly NGOs and people who work in the area and people who have defected, as Matt Kwong wrote on our website this morning, wanted to see more language in that direction. Immediately, what was talked about between the two leaders in this final one-page deal won't have a difference, I can't imagine, in the lives of everyday people in North Korea. But long-term peace certainly would. And the question of economics here plays into that as well, because long-term, what the North Koreans would like to see is a relief of some of the sanctions and pressure. And there's some thought that maybe not giving up the authoritarian version of their government, they might want more of an economy such as China, where you have more free market investment. And if indeed that is something that eventually comes down the road as a result of this agreement, then that does have the possibility of improving life for people in North Korea, but not there yet. I'm just going through the questions here to make sure that I'm able to answer them to the best of my ability. You're watching the CBC News feed on Facebook as well as YouTube. We're taking your questions about the historic agreement between the President of the United States and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. Unprecedented handshake, lots of fanfare, lots of meeting, and I think that the next question will come also from Facebook from Lori Karen. Is there any way to check if North Korea is keeping their word? And this is what's difficult about North Korea, Lori, is how hard it is to really know if what they're doing is in line with their promises. And North Korea has backed away from promises before, secretly maintaining a nuclear program while saying they were doing just the opposite. The way that the CIA and the United States would go through and figure out what the extent of the nuclear program is through satellite images and those sorts of ways of seeing what's actually happening in North Korea. But many of the actual building of missiles and testing can happen underground. And it's very tough when there are no international inspectors to go in and see if denuclearization is actually taking place. And in the agreement signed today, which doesn't mean that there might be more details down the line, there was no talk of a way to verify and a way to inspect. Previously, North Korea has allowed inspectors in other situations. So that's not to say that the possibility for that doesn't exist, but there was nothing in what we saw today that makes it easier to figure out if they're living up to their promises. So that is one of the things that I think, to quote the president, we'll have to see what happens. We'll see what happens. Deb Dobson, interesting point here, because she's right. She says on Facebook, do you think that a one-page agreement that has no solidity to it is historic? The agreement isn't historic, Deb, but certainly the optics of what happened today are historic. The idea that a U.S. president would have a summit, a face-to-face meeting with the dictator from North Korea is in itself, the very fact that it happened, a historic development. And you can see that in a couple of different ways. You can see it, I think, as the White House wants to see it as sort of this topsy-turvy diplomacy, where you take the leaders first and then you build in all the details later. And it's never been done that way before. Very different from all the ways in which previous State Departments and previous administrations have dealt with North Korea. And the way that all of those State Departments and administrations have dealt with North Korea haven't worked. So maybe it will. On the flip side, you have those that say that the very thought of having this meeting where the flags were side by side, there's the stars and stripes against the North Korean flag, where the two leaders are smiling and shaking hands and flattering each other, where Kim Jong-un, a murderous dictator, gets the chance to do a walkabout as though he were Prince Harry through the streets of Singapore. That in itself is a concession. And either way, if you fall into the category that this is something that is not going to be good in the long term, or something that could spark something very well, is historic in both of those situations. So the actual text of the agreement isn't where the remarkable thing is. And I think I'm going to have to cut short our talk here. I think that sometimes in the White House they move us in to check out the security situation of some kind. So, oh, now we're okay. Sorry about that. Don't go away. Not entirely sure what was going on there, but this is part and parcel of the drama of being at the White House. We had been asked for a moment to go into the press briefing room. That happens sometimes when there's any kind of potential threat. You know, there's tons of protesters outside the gates over there. There's a lot of activity in Washington, D.C. because there's another big news event today, and that is that Alexander Ovechkin is going to be roaming through the streets of Washington with the Stanley Cup. So that little distraction there is nothing to be worried about at this stage in the game. And I'll continue to take your questions. From YouTube, another question here that I think that they're saying that North Korea was so aggressive with their military weapons testing not too long ago, and you're right there. Now they have become so docile, making drastic changes in such a short period. Why such a quick change? I think we have to look at why North Korea was building up its nuclear weapons in the first place. It wanted to get to a state where they could achieve legitimacy. And one of the issues, or the major issue that North Korea has been dealing with this whole time, is the idea that the regime be allowed to continue. And the idea that the United States could go in and take out Kim and take out the regime and the dynasty is an existential threat that has existed for Kim and his father and his grandfather before him. So you build up the weapons, you test the weapons, and that's a show of strength. Combine that with the progressive leader in South Korea, and there is an opportunity. And this could be, although it's impossible to know for sure, the strategy that Kim was employing to this point. There's a whole other factor here, and that is the economy. It is incredibly poor, except for those that aren't, in North Korea. When Kim took power from his father, he recognized that in order to maintain power, he was going to have to make some economic changes, because the images of the famine in the 90s and the abject poverty that people like Sasha Petrusik, who was in North Korea not long ago, aren't allowed to see, but we know exists, are not sustainable. So when you combine the poverty with the isolation of the sanctions, which got a lot worse in the past several months because of the way that China also enforced those sanctions, there's that motivation as well. So it's a combination of seizing a moment, really, that the regime has created with its weapons, at the same time as wanting to solve a problem, all within the context of Kim wanting to maintain power in the region. So thanks for these questions. They're good. I really do appreciate how thoughtful you've been. Matthew Hoover on Facebook. How can North Korea trust the USA to honor any deals if the U.S. backs out of previous agreements? And that is with Iran and Paris as being examples. That's been a question that a lot of people have been asking, Matthew, because it's, one hand in the other. I think that is the problem when you have different political masters, different administrations coming in. You do run the risk of political decisions being made. Donald Trump would answer that question in the sense of, trust me, I'm the major deal maker here. But I think we have to appreciate a certain degree of skepticism, not just by North Korea, but with the whole world. When you look at the way this administration is upending the way it treats its allies in comparison with people that have been traditional foes, there is a sense that the chaos that Donald Trump, by design or by accident, is throwing out into the world order that was established after World War II is causing a lot of people to question what the U.S. is going to do next and how that will influence other parts of the world and other agreements. So North Korea would probably be wise to look at this deal with a certain degree of skepticism. The other piece to remember in all of this is Congress, because if you get to the point where you're talking about an actual agreement or something more than what we saw today, there are members of Congress who believe in order to make that happen, in order to give it an enforceability, it needs to be voted on and passed by both the House and the Senate. And I think if that were indeed to happen with some sort of deal, then it would be tougher for any administration, even if there was a change in the White House, to renege on those promises internationally. All right. Just scrolling through these questions that you're sending. I really appreciate all of the interest in this. Cheryl Simpson, who's writing on YouTube, is asking about South Korea, and she wants to know what happens if South Korea has no military from the United States and the U.S. pulls out of South Korea. I think that is probably an unlikely scenario at this point. It was interesting when the idea of stopping those exercises was raised by the president in what was very much a surprise to South Korea. It was also a surprise to the Pentagon. And while there has been talk of troop reductions, James Mattis, the defense secretary, had said those conversations weren't happening at this stage. And if they did happen, they would be done with South Korea, a traditional ally of the United States. I can't imagine a scenario where you would pull directly to moving out all troops, although you have to remember that America First. We have a squirrel. I don't know, you probably can't see him, but it's a little bit distracting because he's running around the tripod. A White House squirrel is very interested in your questions. Anyway, removing all troops out of South Korea does not appear to be something that's on the table. What Donald Trump says in a meeting with just the interpreters and Kim Jong-un is different from the kinds of policies he would have listening to his advisors. I think it's very key to look at what Mattis has said in particular particular in the past, that those conversations, the discussion of the alliance, would have to happen in conjunction with South Korea. And those kinds of conversations are likely happening with Mike Pompeo now that the summit is over. I'm sorry, I was distracted by the squirrel. I have another question here from Weiza. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Afzal, she's writing on Facebook, was human rights discussed? And the answer to that is yes, although I'm not sure to what extent they got around to those discussions. When Donald Trump was asked about that repeatedly in his press conference, he said that it was brought up and that it was brought up in a hard manner, that it was a tough conversation. He also described the situation in North Korea as rough, and that other places are rough too. I think that won't be enough to please those human rights advocates who point to the absolutely horrific human rights situation in North Korea. But it's also important to point out that that was never the goal of this summit anyway. The United States was going in with the goal of denuclearizing, and I think any expectation that you'd walk out of there with a comprehensive plan to improve human rights for North Koreans, it was not surprising that neither of these leaders lived up to that. Thanks again for your questions. If you are just turning in on your Facebook page, you're watching CBC News Network, but an extended Facebook Live version where I'm doing my best to answer your questions about the North Korea-US summit that happened in Singapore today. And I'm going through the questions here. One of the questions that's just coming in, I'm trying to pick the ones I know how to answer. Colleen on Facebook asked, why was Singapore the meeting place? And I'm trying to remember all of the different factors that went into this, but those are one of those decisions that are very carefully considered by both countries. And the reason for that is there is a great deal of symbolism in terms of a place where these talks could have. Singapore makes a lot of sense for a number of reasons, one of which is it's not that far away for Kim Jong-un, who doesn't have the greatest planes. I believe he flew in on a Chinese aircraft, and that it was easy for him to get to. There is a certain sense of neutrality. It is a very, I guess, authoritarian light would be the way to describe Singapore, in the sense that it has the security capacity to be able to handle such a high-profile meeting. It has the fancy hotels. We saw how the security just was able to block off street after street after street, and that would be a much easier thing to do in Singapore than in a place such as DC, where they're struggling to get well, they know how to do it in DC, but they're working on the Capitol's parade right now, and there's a lot of different factors that were at play. And certainly coming to DC, if indeed it were ever to happen, sends an entirely different diplomatic message. Singapore certainly a neutral kind of place for both of these leaders to meet. I'm continuing to go through your questions. I think I may have caught up here, skipped past some when I was distracted by the squirrel. Oh, this is an interesting one from Daniel Lopez. He's writing on YouTube, and he wants to know what would happen if China stopped cooperating. Would that endanger the current talks? This is a complicated relationship, because how these countries, the power dynamic between them, goes back for many decades, if not centuries. China's cooperation on sanctions is key to maintaining pressure on North Korea to be able to live up to its promises, So China's cooperation definitely necessary on that point. The China will be pleased to see that this is the possibility of reductions in those military exercises, because the Chinese would have an interest in breaking up or making less strong the American and South Korean alliance in the region. China's goal is obviously to be as strong an economic and military player, not just in the region, but in the world. We see that from their 5 and 10 and 50-year plans. China has another concern in all of this. It has a large interest in some kind of peace deal, because another thing that the Chinese don't want is for the implosion of the Kim regime and the flock of refugees that would mean coming into China. Also, if, and I think this addresses one of the other questions there, if relations do become somewhat normalized, there are economic opportunities for China. So yes, China is a key player in this, and it was really interesting to see Donald Trump kind of blame China for part of the reason why the rhetoric got worse before the summit was canceled and then on again. I think everyone wants to maintain their power in this struggle, and China definitely a player in that. Complicated question. I hope I did a decent enough job of pointing out some of the issues. Going through your questions again. Daniel Hill is writing in on YouTube. He says, will there be a peace treaty signed between South and North Korea soon? That was one of the things that had been discussed as a possibility out of this summit. They didn't get there. They didn't get to an agreement perhaps as meaningful as many would have hoped. Even at that, though, a peace agreement between North and South Korea, is still just largely, it still has a large degree of symbolism to it, because as we were talking about the influence of China, seeing it would need to be a signatory onto any sort of formal peace treaty. But I think as we look to the steps that are coming next, a peace treaty, a peace agreement is one of the things both parties would probably ultimately like to achieve, but we're not there yet. Mohammed Ehsan is writing on Facebook, the USA would probably talk to South Korea and Japan in the post-conference period. This is true. Do you think the USA would do the same with China and with Russia? Yes, I think that very much China is a key player in this, and that speaking to President Xi is an important and a significant step to be taken here. Russia is always a little bit more complicated. It was very interesting to see that in this opening, the Kim also met with Sergei Lavrov, who is the foreign minister for Russia. The opening towards the United States is duplicated by opening to other countries which they may have an allegiance. The U.S., the president has talked about wanting to talk to Russia. There has been talk about a potential meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Trump just last weekend said that he would welcome Vladimir Putin and Russia back into the G8. Should any of that ever happen, obviously, North Korea would likely be one of the issues that would be discussed, but that is an incredibly fraught relationship when you consider that the Russians were involved in influencing or attempting to influence the outcome of the last election in 2016, that it is widely believed by all intelligence communities here that they're still trying to do that as we go into the midterms in 2018. The relationships with the poisoning attack in London, the expelling meeting of diplomats. It's an incredibly complicated relationship, even before you consider the Mueller investigation into Donald Trump's own personal ties with Russia. So North Korea, I can't see a phone conversation or a discussion happening on this issue specifically. If there is a larger pattern of engagement between the two countries, it would be one of the things that would come up. I hope that I answered that correctly. It's all quite complicated when you put all of the pieces together. And I think that I may have caught up with, oh, there's another one. This is from YouTube. Do you think Trump will destroy all sanctions and limitations to trading with Korea and China after all of this? Well, Donald Trump did say he believed in a totally free trade tariff world when he was at the G7, a position that was largely seen to be something that was designed to create chaos. I cannot see a situation whereby all sanctions and tariffs would disappear. Donald Trump is more protectionist than he is a free trader, although he's surrounded by others who have differing views, less now than perhaps he was before. So I don't think that is a possibility. Oh, and a question from Dallas, Texas. Thank you for watching in the States. This is a tough one. This feels like an assignment, but I'll do my best. In a few sentences, tell us how it started, what happened at the start and in the middle, and how I think it's going to end. What was the ultimate goal that was attained? Okay, I think I'm going to jump to the last bit too, and I think we cannot dismiss that the ultimate goal is in the short term. No one's threatened to bomb the other country at the moment right now. A year ago, we were talking about fire and fury. That's not happening now. So that goal of short-term peace has been achieved through this historic engagement between the two countries. To start it off, I think that Kim Jong-un saw an opportunity. He had built up the weapons. His people are poor, and there was a progressive regime in South Korea, and now was the time to get engagement going. The President of the United States sees an opportunity for an historic achievement. He stands in front of his supporters who yell, "Nobel, Nobel, Nobel," and he really feels motivated to bring peace to the region, potentially saving lives, at the same time as really doing something that would bring a real degree of polish and renown to his presidency in history. And I don't think we can underestimate the amount that matters to Donald Trump. In the middle, they went back and forth. They said it wasn't going to happen. They said it was going to happen. In the end, they met. It was probably more spectacle than substance. These are both men who are dramatic in their presentations to their home countries. There's a reality TV style show to all of it, like there is with much of the presidency. Substantively, not much more was achieved, or certainly much more wasn't achieved than had been historically. I think the United States probably walks away looking like they made more concessions than they intended to. But overall, how do I think this is going to end? I think it might not, or at least not for a long time. One of the things, now that he has achieved the ability of standing there legitimately against the president, there is an interest for Kim Jong-un to drag this out, to have more meetings, to keep talking, to let in some inspectors, to do whatever, ease some sanctions. Also, the process of denuclearization, as Trump mentioned today in his news conference, is something that does take time. So even those Trump skeptics who thought that that they're not impressed with the president's style liked it when there was a managing of expectations here. The ongoing talks and plans and strategies for ultimate denuclearization for North Korea is going to be something that continues, I would say, throughout the rest of Donald Trump's presidency, perhaps into his second term. This is a long-term issue. And I'm just going through. I think I have to be on News Network. My watch is ringing. That's probably Toronto, trying to figure out why I'm still talking. So I'm just going to take another quick look through. Last question. This is from YouTube. What would be the worst case scenario if Kim goes back on his words? Does the United States have anything to lose? Well, I think everyone agreed that the worst case scenario would be some kind of military action, whether provoked by the North Koreans or whether there are those within the administration here who would again return to the idea of some sort of preemptive strike. The main achievement of the diplomacy and engagement between Kim and Trump over the last few months has been that we have moved back from that step. So what does the United States have to lose? I think, what does the world have to lose? If this becomes a situation with the military people attempting to go to war, essentially, then the U.S. bases, the people in Seoul, all of those people potentially would be under a direct threat. And that is something that no one wants to see happen. And it is something that has been drawn back, prevented by the fact that these two men met together today. Whatever you believe about the substance of what they achieved, whatever you believe about the president's language in terms of praising a brutal dictator, I will quote my friend Keith again, because you should check out his analysis story, which may have been posted on CBC.ca right now, where he says, talking to the North Koreans is like waking up in the morning. It is better than the alternative. And the alternative is something that I think many people hope we continue to avoid. Thank you so much for your patience and all of your great questions. Thanks for the security threat and the squirrel that distracted me. It's wonderful to talk to you here from the White House in Washington, D.C. Thanks very much and have a wonderful day.